"Dad, stop this," I yelled in anger, panic evident in my voice. He didn't stop, instead becoming more violent. "Dad, why are you doing this to me?" My voice was choked, weak and shaky, as if I didn't even recognize my own voice. "My name is Lily, and today I will tell you a story that I will never forget in my life. It was a long nightmare, slowly growing over time, and I did not know when I could escape. It all started quietly, but day by day, I realized that I was being drawn into a dark spiral, with no way out. It all started when my husband and I were still living with my father-in-law, in the big house that I thought would be our home. My husband's name is John, a kind, thoughtful man, and loved me very much. We had been married for 3 years, and during that time I thought I was the luckiest woman in the world. Our marriage seemed perfect. John always made me feel safe, and he was the one I could rely on at all times. We lived in his family's big house, with my father-in-law. Everything seemed to be going well, from his career to his family life. I am a free-spirited girl, who loves freedom and is not shy about new things. Before getting married, I had a vibrant life, not tied down by anything, but since meeting John, I feel ready to settle down for a new life of my own. My father-in-law Matthew was also a pitiful man. He had experienced many hardships in his life, especially the loss of his wife when John, my husband, was still a child. His wife died in a serious car accident, and since then Matthew became a single father. He shouldered all the responsibilities, being both a father and a mother to raise John. That made him tough and strong in front of outsiders, but inside he was filled with pain and loneliness that could not be relieved. Our family lived in a small village, far from town, where it was quiet and airy. Our house was on a small hill, surrounded by fields and sparse houses. The air here was always fresh and peaceful, but sometimes I felt lonely, especially when John, my husband, had to go on business trips. When we first got married, my husband and I were very affectionate. We were deeply in love, and were not afraid to show affection even when Matthew was home. John was a warm and caring husband, and every time he came home, I felt close and safe in his arms. We often spent evenings together, sitting by the fire or just being intimate. I was not afraid to show my closeness to my husband, even though I knew Matthew was always in the house, sometimes just across the wall. At first, when I first got married, I also felt embarrassed and shy around my father-in-law. His presence, with his serious appearance and calm personality, made me always try to keep my distance and behave properly. Mathew had an authoritative air that made me feel uncomfortable, and I have to admit that. In the first months after getting married, I was always careful in every action and word in front of him. But then, over time, that feeling of shyness also faded. I began to get used to his presence in this house, and gradually no longer felt shy. Matthew was always polite, thoughtful, and there were times when he was very friendly, which made me feel more comfortable. We started to talk more, and no longer kept a distance like the first days. As I said, I am a liberal girl, and that did not change even when I got married. I have always been confident with my body and like to wear clothes that flatter my beauty. Tight dresses and tight t-shirts are always my choice, because I feel comfortable and confident in them. Even when I am at home, I still keep that style. At first I felt a little shy when wearing tight clothes in front of Matthew, but gradually that shyness disappeared. I thought, I am John's wife. There is nothing to hide or be ashamed of. There were evenings when John and I sit together in the living room, chatting or simply sitting close to each other, and I do not find anything unusual when Matthew is present. I always think that he is just a good father-in-law, who has experienced many losses in his life, and now only wants to see his son and daughter-in-law happy. My intimacy with John does not make me feel embarrassed when he is around, because I believe that it is normal in a family. Also, because of my comfort and openness, it seems that things gradually change in a way that I did not expect. At first, when I wore tight clothes or sat next to John, Matthew's eyes would glance over, making me feel uncomfortable. But gradually, I realized that those looks were no longer accidental. At first, when I wore tight clothes or sat next to John, Matthew's eyes would glance over, making me feel uncomfortable. But gradually I realized that the look was no longer accidental. I remember one time, when John was away on a business trip, I was home alone with Matthew. That night I wore a comfortable but somewhat sexy nightgown, the way I usually wear at home. When I walked into the kitchen to get some water, I caught Matthew's eyes looking straight at me. A gaze that was not that of a father-in-law, looking at his daughter-in-law. It felt like an electric current ran through me. I tried to calm myself down, telling myself that I was thinking too much, but that gaze remained in my mind, like an unpleasant sign that I could not forget. It was hard to describe, but his gaze became clearer and clearer. It was not admiration or concern as I had thought, but curiosity, a somewhat invasive gaze. Matthew's gazes began to become more ominous, from fleeting glances to fixed stares that I could not ignore. He began to act more and more confusingly, his intimate gestures going beyond the limits of what I had thought was a normal relationship between a father-in-law and daughter-in-law. At first I told myself that maybe I was overthinking it, that Matthew was just trying to help me with the housework. But as time went on, I realized more and more that something was wrong. Matthew always showed enthusiasm to help me, but gradually his help became less than selfless. He often appeared whenever I hung the clothes, his eyes following my every move clearly. There were times when he came over with a smile on his face and said he would help me hang the clothes. At that time, I did not refuse, thinking that he simply wanted to help me with the work. However, I began to notice that his actions were no longer normal help. One time, when I was hanging the clothes, Matthew accidentally touched my hand. At first I ignored it, but after a few similar times, the intentionality became too obvious. Every time he touched my hand, there was a slight hesitation, as if he wanted to prolong that moment. I was startled and pulled my hand back, but Matthew kept smiling, not seeming embarrassed or feeling wrong. Whenever it rained, Matthew would quickly go out to the yard to help me collect the clothes. But what started to worry me was that he didn't hesitate to touch sensitive items. Instead of doing it discreetly like a normal father-in-law would do, he picked them up naturally, even folded them neatly, and put them in the laundry basket, as if nothing unusual happened. His gesture made me shiver, but I dared not say it out loud, afraid that I was overthinking it. I remember clearly one time, when it started to rain heavily, I was in the kitchen preparing lunch. Looking out the window, I saw Matthew rushing out to the yard to collect the clothes to dry. At first I was grateful that he helped me when I was busy, but then I stood still when I saw him pick up my underwear without hesitation. He had no hesitation in picking them up, glancing at them, and then putting them in the basket, with a slight smile on his face. The sight made me feel uncomfortable, and I realized that his help was no longer just a family matter. The intimacy in Matthew's actions gradually became too obvious, and I began to feel anxious whenever I was alone with him. But what was even more frightening was that I did not know how to tell John, because I was afraid that he would not believe me, or worse, he would think I was exaggerating everything. I kept quiet, but my heart grew more and more uneasy and panicked about what was happening in the house that should have been the safest place for me. Until one day that I will never forget in this life. That day, everything started like any other normal day. John, my husband, still went to work early, leaving the house with only me and my father-in-law, Mr. Mathew. As usual, after John left, Matthew would go to work in the fields early in the morning. I was used to that routine and felt secure when the house was empty, with only me. A feeling of freedom and comfort filled the space when I knew I had the whole morning to relax. That day I decided to rest on the sofa in the living room, where my father-in-law usually sits to watch TV in the evening. Thinking that he had gone to the fields and no one was home, I thoughtlessly wore a cool outfit, a bit more revealing than usual. It was just a habit of mine, because I was always confident about my body and didn't feel that wearing comfortable clothes at home was a big deal. I stretched out on the chair, relaxed my body and let myself fall into a deep sleep. The soft feeling of the chair and the quietness of the house made me completely relaxed, without any defense. The space was so quiet that I completely fell asleep without knowing that everything would change in just a moment. It all started from that moment. My father-in-law, who I thought was busy in the fields, for some reason came home earlier than usual. Maybe he finished his work early, or maybe he found an excuse to come back. But the scary thing was that I was completely unaware of his return. He entered the house without saying anything, without making any sound. His footsteps were so soft, and in my deep sleep, I didn't notice. Mathew stood there, his eyes glued to me. I couldn't feel his gaze, couldn't realize that something was terribly wrong. I lay there, innocently in my revealing clothes, completely unaware that I was the object of his gaze. In the next few seconds, his gaze seemed to change, and that was the beginning of a chain of events that I will never forget. At that moment, I was still sleeping soundly, completely oblivious to his presence, a presence that would lead to horrors that I could not foresee. He stood there, looking at me for a long time, his gaze unreadable and complex. I could not tell whether the thoughts in his head had existed before, or had just exploded in that moment. A man who had been a widower for many years, lonely in his own home, now stood before a young woman as vibrant and attractive as me. Perhaps he could no longer suppress his instincts. I lay there, defenseless, carefree in my comfortable clothes, unaware that I was the target of a lustful gaze. Without warning, he suddenly pounced. His whole body rushed towards me, and before I could react, he had me in his arms. His arms were wrapped tightly around me, as if he was determined not to let me go. His movements were so fast, so strong, that I felt as if I was being strangled. I could hardly believe what was happening. A feeling of dread washed over me, and I tried to struggle, but his strength was overwhelming. "Dad, what are you doing?" I screamed, panicking, but he didn't respond. Instead of stopping, he didn't say a word. Continuing his actions, his greedy arms began to grope all over my body. I felt every touch possessive, every line of my body was explored without shame. Fear and panic surged through me. I tried to resist, using all my strength to push him away. But my body was too weak, and he was muscular and strong. All my efforts were in vain. I couldn't escape his greedy grip. "Dad, stop this," I screamed in anger, panic evident in my voice. He didn't stop, instead becoming more violent. Tears welled up in my eyes. Fear and humiliation overwhelmed me. My heart shattered at the painful betrayal. I couldn't believe that the person I once trusted could do this to me. The pain in my heart mixed with fear, and I felt completely helpless, trapped in a nightmare with no way out. But now, my father-in-law no longer cared about anything. He didn't hear my pleas, didn't pay attention to my resistance. "Just give me one more time, son." His voice was low, ringing like a plea. The sound made me feel scared and disgusted. My heart felt like it was breaking. But how could I accept that? How could I accept something that was never supposed to happen? I tried my best to resist, using every ounce of strength in my body to break free from his grasp. But all my efforts were in vain. He was too strong, and his will was now clouded by lust. I was exhausted. All my resistance was weak and hopeless. After my father-in-law had done that terrible deed, he stood up, as if relieved of a burden, and said something I could never forget: "I'm sorry." The apology echoed in the quiet space, but it had no weight on me. How could an apology erase what he had just done? How could a word change this painful truth? I sat there silent, tears falling nonstop. My body trembled with humiliation and pain, as if drowning in the ultimate betrayal. There were no words left to say, only tears. How could I forgive him? How could I continue to live in this house when everything was destroyed? Those questions kept ringing in my head, and I knew that from this moment on, nothing would ever be the same again. "Dad, why did you do this to me?" My voice was choked, weak and trembling, as if I didn't even recognize my own voice. The question echoed in the space, full of despair and horror. I couldn't believe what was happening, that the man I once respected could do this to me. After that I sat and cried all day, tears silently falling without stopping. The pain and humiliation tormenting me could not be relieved. I waited until John returned from work, my mind in turmoil and not knowing where to start. When he got home I couldn't keep quiet anymore. What I had experienced was too horrible to hide. I told him everything, every detail, my voice lost in tears. John was silent for a moment, his eyes filled with shock and disbelief. Every word I said was like a knife cutting deep into his heart. Anger welled up in his eyes, but mixed with it was pain and disappointment. He stood up, walked towards Mathew, tried to face the reality he couldn't accept. "Dad, why did you do this? What did you do?" John's voice trembled, as if each word was a burden he couldn't bear. Mathew just stood there, head bowed, saying nothing, and that only made John more nervous. He was his father's son, and despite his anger, he was still bound by family ties. How could he face this painful truth, that the father he had always respected had betrayed everything he believed in? John turned away, no longer daring to look at Mathew. He couldn't accept the truth, but he couldn't help but face it. "You destroyed everything. Everything I believed in." His voice trailed off, crushed by deep disappointment. John didn't speak again that night. I could see the struggle in his eyes, a battle between loyalty to his family and love for me. He sat silently, staring into space, as if searching for answers to the unexplainable. He couldn't forgive Mathew, but he couldn't completely cut ties with his father either. It left him emotionally lost. The next morning, when we decided to leave this house, John silently packed his things. He didn't look back at the house. But I knew in his heart that this separation was not just for the house, but for a part of himself. "I'm sorry, Lily, but there was nothing I could do." His voice was heavy, as if he were carrying the weight of both the past and the future. His steps were slow, heavy, as if each step was a struggle with himself. I looked at John, my heart heavy, knowing that we were both trapped in this pain with no way out. How could we continue to live together knowing that the shadow of this horror always hung over our family? That night, after everything was revealed, we sat in silence. Neither of us said a word to the other, but in John's eyes, I saw the pain, the disappointment, and the helplessness. I couldn't stay in this place another minute, and John, though confused, knew that we had to leave. This house, once the place where we thought we would build a happy life, now held only pain and indelible betrayal. We packed up that night, taking only the essentials. Each step out of that house was like brushing aside a memory that I didn't want to remember anymore. John didn't say much, but I knew he was also deeply wounded by his father's betrayal. The night enveloped us as we left the house, the distant streetlights illuminating the path ahead. Not a word of goodbye, not a single glance back. From that moment on, I knew we would never return to that place again. The house that had once been our home was now just a forgotten memory, a place filled with pain that we could no longer touch. After leaving my father-in-law's house, we started a new life in a completely different place, far away from the painful past. John, although it was very difficult, chose to face the truth about his father. He did not go back to confront Mathew after that night, and we both accepted that going back would only make things more complicated and painful. We built a life away from the house that held so much hurt. Mathew stayed there, and we did not keep in touch. It was a decision we both agreed on, although John still carried the pain of his father's betrayal. From that painful event, I learned that not all family relationships can maintain trust and love forever. Sometimes we have to let go to protect ourselves from deeper pain. Facing the truth and choosing to walk away is not a sign of weakness, but the only way to retain self-respect and security of mind. Through this experience, I also realized that true love is not only the existence of two people, but also the ability to overcome the greatest barriers to protect each other. John and I chose to protect our lives from toxicity, even if it meant leaving our loved ones. Our lives have stabilized since then, but the wounds in our hearts are still there. John still occasionally mentions his father, in the most painful moments, as if he still cannot completely let go. Will he forgive Mathew later, or will he one day return to face the past? That I do not know. I can only hope that we will continue to build a life without the past haunting us, although forgiving or forgetting will be a journey that each person must overcome on their own. The final outcome is still unclear, but I believe that we did the right thing, chose the best path to protect each other,